Hi everybody, I'm Scott L. Miller. This is Sam IT. Today we're going to talk about replicated local storage, or RLS. Now, a lot of you are going to be familiar with replicated storage systems, such as SAN or NAS, where your black box storage has a mirrored pair, and they take care of themselves by replicating one from the other, generally in real time. This helps you get high availability storage solutions, and we often associate this type of thing with SAN and NAS, even though technically there's no requirement for SAN or NAS to have any kind of functionality like that, but they often do. What's interesting is, of course, that to SAN or NAS, they are just servers. So any storage inside of them is local, not SAN or NAS. The fact that it's SAN or NAS is purely from the perspective of the outside observer. What they are using under the hood is local storage, and they are replicating that local storage from one server node to another. And this is why we call it replicated local storage. It is the mechanism that simply replicates your local storage. This should be kind of apparent, and yet storage devices tend to be such black boxes and mysteries that people tend to forget that they are servers themselves, that their own storage is local to them, and that any mechanism they use would be acting on local storage, not acting on a SAN. Now, if we were to go grab a server or any system ourselves, put disks into it, and make it local storage, we of course are roughly in the same position as being a SAN or NAS. Our storage is local. If we want to replicate that to another server, of course we can use any of the same mechanisms used by a SAN or NAS to do so, and we can have our own replicated local storage. We're looking at this, of course, backwards. This is a very silly way to look at it. Of course, the core here is that storage can be replicated. SAN and NAS are simply specific network devices that leverage this as part of their products in special cases. Many don't even leverage that at all. With our own products, with our own local storage, we have lots of options on the market or things that we can build ourselves that allow us to replicate local storage. We'll mention some, but these are just things we're mentioning. It's important to understand this is a general concept and is available in all kinds of different ways and modes and products, and with support, without support, on every operating system, on every virtualization platform. There's so many ways to take your local storage and replicate it, but it's important to understand some real-world implementations to make it easy to understand what we're talking about. Built into Linux, into the kernel, is a local storage replication technology called DRBD. A similar thing is built into FreeBSD. It's called HAST, H-A-S-T. There are several products that can be added on top of lots of other operating systems, such as Gluster and Ceph. In the virtualization world, we may see replicated local storage with tools such as Hewlett-Packard's VSA, or VMware's vSAN, or Starwind's vSAN. These kinds of products are all over the place. Lots of different vendors, from the operating system vendors themselves, to third-party storage vendors, to third-party hardware makers, to third-party virtualization companies. And then there's probably others as well. This is a broad category with lots of options, but one that is strangely poorly understood. There's a lot of different ways that these things interact and work with each other. So DRBD and Starwind's vSAN and Gluster are three completely different animals, and yet they all take your local storage and replicate it. Some common mechanisms for doing this include using network RAID or RAIN systems, both of which we'll talk about in other videos. And there can be even others, such as how DRBD works. It uses a native protocol of its own that's not technically any of those things. So we have lots of options, and under the hood, these mechanisms are simply being used inside a SAN to replicate its storage locally. So all replication at the end of the day is probably based around replicated local storage, and we often overlook it though, assuming that SAN and NAS are doing something magic and that their ability to provide high availability storage is unique to the fact that they're a SAN. But that's not at all true. They are simply doing things that can be done inside our own server, so anything you see as beneficial inside of them, look for a way to do it with your own local storage, and that might be what you're looking for. It's just important to understand that it's not a special case, it's a general case of how storage is replicated. So RLS is one of those key concepts inside of IT, even though it's almost never mentioned, which is really surprising because it's so important, so common, and each of its underlying components so often comes up in conversation, yet we never group them together, even though they represent a common group of technologies that do something very important and are relatively interchangeable. For example, anytime you're going to use DRVD, you could have replaced that with a vSAN product, and yes, they do it very differently, and your approach to installing it would be very different, but their final behavior of allowing you to share local storage between multiple machines, because it's been replicated, doesn't change. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. Talk about your questions in the comments below. Is there some technology that you've seen that you think is RLS, or there's an RLS question that you have, something you want to investigate? Ask away. And as always, remember to like and subscribe, and you can sponsor us on Patreon.